In the winter of 1944, as the Third Army prepared to turn north toward Bastogne, George Patton stood alone in a frozen chapel near Nancy, France. He wasn't praying for victory. He was praying for clear weather. Not because he needed air support, because he believed God was listening to him personally, and he expected an answer within 72 hours. 3 days later, the skies cleared. Patton never questioned whether it was coincidence. To him, the evidence was obvious. He had asked. Heaven had responded. And that clarity, that certainty in forces most men only hoped existed, ran deeper in Patton than almost anyone realized. This isn't the history you learned in school. This is the psychology of a madman who won the war. Subscribe now if you want more of this, and after you've heard what follows, leave a comment with your answer to this do. You think Patton's belief in reincarnation made him a better general or a more reckless one? I'm genuinely curious what you think. What you're about to hear isn't a list of trivia. These are 20 details about George S. Patton that reveal who he actually was when no cameras were rolling, when the speeches were over, when he was alone with his thoughts or his habits or his fears. Some of these details are uncomfortable. Some are strange in ways that don't fit the image we have of him, but all of them mattered. They shaped how he led, how he fought, and how he saw himself in a war he believed he'd been preparing for across multiple lifetimes. This is a deeper look, a human look, at one of the most paradoxical figures in American military history. The ivory-handled revolvers were a costume. Everyone remembers the revolvers. 2 of them gleaming, strapped to his waist like a gunslinger from another century. They became part of his image. Photographers loved them. Soldiers recognized him instantly because of them. But here's what most people get wrong. Patton didn't carry them because he expected to use them in combat. He carried them because he understood theater. He once corrected a reporter who called them pearl-handled. Only a pimp in a New Orleans whorehouse carries pearl-handled revolvers, he said. These are ivory. The distinction mattered to him. Ivory suggested old world-class, tradition, something noble. Pearl was vulgar. But the deeper truth is that Patton designed his appearance the way a director designs a character. The revolvers, the polished helmet, the riding boots, even the way he stood, it was all constructed. He believed that soldiers needed to see a commander who looked like he was born for war, and so he gave them one. Every morning, before inspections, before briefings, he made sure the costume was perfect. Because George Patton understood something fundamental about leadership in war. Men follow the image before they follow the man. And if the image is powerful enough, they'll follow it into hell. He believed he had died in battle before. Patton didn't just believe in reincarnation. He claimed to remember his past lives, and he spoke about them with the same certainty he used to describe tank formations. He said he had fought as a Roman legionnaire, as a soldier under Napoleon. He described battlefields he'd never visited in this lifetime with eerie accuracy. Once, while visiting a French town during World War I, he confidently navigated streets he insisted he'd walked 2,000 years earlier as a Roman commander. His driver was unsettled. Patton was calm. This wasn't a metaphor for him. He genuinely believed his soul had been cycling through wars for millennia, learning, evolving, preparing. And that belief had consequences. It made him fearless in ways that unnerved other officers. If you believe you've died in battle a dozen times before and returned each time, then death in this life loses some of its weight. Patton didn't charge forward despite the risk. He charged forward because he believed, on some level, that he was cosmically protected until his purpose was complete. And when soldiers saw a general who seemed utterly unafraid of dying, some of them found courage in that. Others found it disturbing, but no one could ignore it. He wrote poetry in the middle of campaigns while his Third Army tore through France in the summer of 1944. Patton sat in his tent at night and wrote poetry, not letters, not reports, poetry. Verses about war, death, fate, and God. Some of it was decent. Some of it was melodramatic, even by the standards of the 1940s. But it was deeply personal. He wrote about fear, though he'd never admit to fear in front of his men. He wrote about destiny and divine purpose. He wrote about the weight of command. One poem, written during the North Africa campaign, described the loneliness of knowing that every decision he made would kill some of his own soldiers, that the math of war required him to spend lives like currency, and that no one around him could fully understand what that felt like. His staff officers knew he wrote, but most of them never read the poems. If they had, they might have seen a side of Patton that contradicted everything he projected. A man who wasn't just confident, a man who was trying to convince himself, over and over, that what he was doing mattered on a scale beyond the immediate carnage. The poetry was where he worked that out, alone, in the dark, between the battles. He slapped 2 soldiers and nearly destroyed his career August 1943. Sicily. 2 separate field hospitals. 2 soldiers suffering from what we'd now recognize as combat fatigue, post-traumatic stress, psychological collapse under the weight of sustained violence. Patton walked through the wards visiting the wounded. And when he came to these men with no visible injuries, men shaking and silent and hollow-eyed, he snapped. He called them cowards. He slapped one of them across the face. Days later, at another hospital, he did it again, slapped another soldier, threatened him, screamed that he wouldn't have cowards in his army. The incidents were witnessed, reported. And when they reached Eisenhower, the supreme commander faced a choice: court-martial one of his most effective generals, or bury it. Eisenhower chose to bury it, but he forced Patton to apologize, publicly, in front of his men. It humiliated Patton in a way that combat never did. And here's the strange part. Patton genuinely didn't understand why what he'd done was wrong. To him, fear was a weakness to be dominated. He believed that if a man could walk, he could fight. The idea that the mind could break while the body remained intact didn't fit his worldview. He saw psychological wounds as moral failures. Years later, after we understood trauma better, those slaps became a stain on his legacy. But in the moment, what they revealed was this: Patton's strength and his cruelty came from the same place. He demanded from others what he demanded from himself: total, relentless, inhuman endurance. And he couldn't comprehend that not everyone was built the way he was. He prayed before every major operation. Patton prayed constantly, not quietly, not privately in some vague spiritual way. He prayed with the expectation of results. Before the invasion of North Africa, he prayed for success. Before the breakout from Normandy, he prayed for speed. And before the relief of Bastogne, he prayed for weather. That last one became famous because he ordered his chaplain to write a prayer specifically asking God to clear the skies so his planes could fly. The chaplain hesitated. Patton insisted. The prayer was printed on cards and distributed to every soldier in the Third Army. When the weather cleared, Patton awarded the chaplain a Bronze Star. He wasn't joking. He genuinely believed the prayer had worked. And while we can explain the weather as meteorology, as coincidence, Patton never entertained that explanation. To him, God was a commanding officer on a higher plane, and if you approached him with respect and clarity, he responded. This wasn't faith in the soft, hopeful sense. This was transactional. Patton prayed the way other generals requisitioned supplies, with confidence that the request would be fulfilled. And when it was, he saw it as confirmation, not of God's grace, but of his own alignment with divine will. Dyslexia made reading a struggle his whole life. Patton struggled to read. We didn't have the language for dyslexia in his era, so it was just seen as slowness, as a deficiency he had to overcome through sheer force of will. And he did. He read extensively, obsessively, because he believed a commander had to know military history down to the bone. But it took him longer than it should have. He'd read the same passage multiple times to absorb it. He'd stumble over words in ways that embarrassed him, so he compensated, he memorized. He built a mental library of battles, tactics, logistics, terrain. By the time he reached senior command, he could recall details from campaigns fought centuries earlier with startling precision. But the effort it took was invisible to everyone around him. They saw a man who could quote Clausewitz and Caesar. They didn't see the hours he spent alone, rereading, drilling the information into his mind, because the words didn't come easily. And here's what that struggle did. It made him respect preparation in a way that naturally gifted men sometimes don't. Patton never assumed he'd figure it out on the battlefield. He studied because he had to, and that relentless preparation, born from a learning disability he never named, became one of his greatest strengths. He knew the ground. He knew the history. He knew what had worked and what had failed. And when the moment came, all that painful study turned into decisiveness. He designed his own sword before World War I. When Patton was a young cavalry officer, he became obsessed with the idea that the U.S. Army sabers were designed incorrectly. He believed the curved blade was outdated, inefficient for modern mounted combat, so he designed his own. A straight-bladed cavalry saber, optimized for thrusting rather than slashing. He studied European swords, historical fencing techniques, the physics of piercing versus cutting. He submitted his design to the Army, and they adopted it. The model 1913 cavalry saber became known as the Patton sword. It was standard issue for years, and while cavalry combat was already fading by the time it was widely distributed, the fact that Patton had designed it said something important about who he was. He didn't just follow doctrine, he interrogated it. If something seemed wrong, even something as established as the shape of a sword, he'd tear it apart and rebuild it. That impulse, that refusal to accept things just because they'd always been done that way, would define his approach to armored warfare decades later. But there's also something telling in the fact that he put so much energy into perfecting a weapon for a kind of combat that was already dying. Patton loved the romance of the cavalry, the nobility of it, the idea of warfare as something almost chivalric. And even as he became one of the most effective tank commanders in history, a part of him never stopped wishing he'd been born in an era where swords still mattered. He believed in omens and signs. Patton saw patterns everywhere. He read meaning into things other officers dismissed as coincidence. A bird flying overhead before a battle, the way clouds moved, the timing of certain events. He kept track of these signs and adjusted his decisions accordingly, not always. Not in ways that overruled logistics or intelligence, but enough that his staff noticed. They learned not to dismiss it when Patton said something felt wrong or felt right, because often he was correct. Some of this was intuition dressed up in mysticism. Patton had extraordinary situational awareness, and his mind processed information faster than he could always articulate. So when something felt off, it often was. But he didn't describe it that way. He described it as fate, as the universe signaling him, as divine guidance. And because he framed it that way, because he believed it that way, he acted on those feelings with confidence. The danger, of course, was that omens can be interpreted to justify almost anything. And Patton's certainty in his own cosmic significance sometimes made him reckless. He'd push forward when caution made more sense, because he felt destined to succeed. Most of the time, he was right. But the times he was wrong, people died. And Patton never seemed to consider that possibility. To him, if the omen was clear, the outcome was certain, and doubt was just fear in disguise. He had a severely high-pitched voice when Patton spoke in private. His voice didn't match his image. It was high, almost shrill, with a slight lisp that became more pronounced when he was angry. In an era when deep, commanding voices were associated with authority, Patton's voice was a liability. He knew it, and he hated it. So he trained himself to speak differently in public, slower, louder, with more grit. He controlled his pitch, pushed his voice lower, turned it into a weapon. The profanity helped. When Patton launched into one of his legendary tirades, filled with obscenities and threats and vivid imagery, the content distracted from the voice. Soldiers remembered what he said, not how he sounded saying it. But in quieter moments, in staff meetings or one-on-one conversations, the contrast was jarring. Officers who met him for the first time were sometimes surprised. The voice didn't fit the legend, and yet Patton turned even this into an advantage. He became a better public speaker because he had to work at it. He learned to use pauses, emphasis, volume. He understood that delivery mattered as much as content. And by the time he was giving speeches to entire divisions, the voice that had embarrassed him as a young officer had become one of his most effective tools, because he'd spent years learning how to make it sound like the voice of a man who expected to be obeyed. He kept a detailed war diary. Patton wrote in his diary almost every day, not summaries. Detailed accounts of his thoughts, his frustrations, his observations. He recorded conversations with other generals, political tensions, his own doubts about certain strategies. He wrote about Eisenhower, about Montgomery, about the limitations he saw in the Allied command structure. And he wrote about himself, his fears, his ambitions, the gap between who he wanted to be and who he sometimes felt he was. These diaries are some of the most valuable primary sources we have on the Allied command during World War II, but they're also deeply personal. Patton didn't write them for publication. He wrote them to think, to process, to argue with himself on the page. And what they reveal is a man far more reflective than his public persona suggested. He questioned himself constantly, not about his overall strategy, not about his belief in aggressive warfare, but about the execution, about whether he was pushing hard enough, about whether he was being used correctly. There's a loneliness in those entries, a sense that Patton felt misunderstood, underutilized, constrained by men he considered his intellectual inferiors. He believed he could have ended the war faster if they'd just let him move, and whether or not that was true, the belief consumed him. The diary was where he vented that frustration, where he admitted, in ways he never would out loud, that he needed the war to continue because without it, he didn't know who he was. He believed he would die in battle. Patton was convinced, for most of his life, that he would die in combat, not as a fear, as a certainty. He saw it as the logical end to a life defined by war. He'd say it casually to his wife, to his friends. "I'll die in battle. It's the only way it makes sense." And he wasn't morbid about it. He spoke about it the way someone might talk about retirement, as an inevitable next phase. When World War II ended and he survived, something in him broke. He'd outlived his war. The thing he'd been preparing for across lifetimes, if you believed him, was over, and he was still here. He became depressed, angry. He made reckless statements about the Soviets, suggesting the Allies should turn around and fight them next. He couldn't adjust to peacetime. It felt wrong to him, existentially wrong, to be alive when the war was over. Then, in December 1945, a car accident, a collision on a road in Germany. Patton was paralyzed from the neck down. He lingered for 12 days, fully conscious, unable to move, and then he died, not in battle, not leading a charge, in a hospital bed from injuries sustained in a mundane traffic accident. The irony wasn't lost on the people who knew him. The man who believed he was destined to die gloriously in combat died in one of the most ordinary ways possible, and maybe that was the universe's final comment on George Patton's certainty about his own fate. He fired competent officers for being boring. Patton valued aggression and charisma in his subordinates almost as much as he valued competence. If an officer was effective but lacked what Patton called drive, he'd replace him, not quietly, publicly. He wanted officers who radiated energy, who inspired men just by being in the room. And if you were capable but dull, you were gone. This created tension with other commanders, especially Eisenhower, who valued steadiness and reliability. But Patton believed that in fast-moving armored warfare, personality mattered. A tank division commander couldn't just be tactically sound. He had to be able to push men past exhaustion, past fear, past reason. And that required a certain kind of presence. Patton called it command aura, the ability to make men believe they could do the impossible just because you told them to. So he staffed his army with officers who mirrored his own intensity. Men who were aggressive to the point of recklessness. Men who'd rather apologize for going too far than ask permission to advance. And it worked. The Third Army moved faster, hit harder, and caused more chaos behind enemy lines than almost any other Allied formation. But the cost was high. Some of those aggressive officers made catastrophic mistakes. And Patton, who'd fired men for being too cautious, sometimes found himself defending men who'd been too bold. Because to him, boldness was always preferable to caution, even when it got people killed. He studied his enemies like a psychologist. Patton didn't just study German tactics. He studied German commanders. He read their writings, analyzed their decisions in past campaigns, built psychological profiles of how they thought, Rommel especially. Patton studied Rommel obsessively. He read Infantry Attacks, Rommel's book on tactics from World War I, multiple times. He analyzed Rommel's movements in North Africa, looking for patterns, tendencies, vulnerabilities. And when Patton finally faced the Afrika Korps, he approached the battles as if he were playing chess against Rommel himself, even when the Desert Fox wasn't physically present on the battlefield. Rommel was often in Germany, or sick, or facing Montgomery elsewhere. But Patton fought against his doctrine, his methods, his ghost. He'd anticipate moves based not just on terrain or logistics, but on what he believed Rommel would do based on personality, and he was often right. He'd predict an attack or a withdrawal before intelligence confirmed it, because he'd internalized how Rommel thought. This wasn't standard practice. Most generals focused on enemy capabilities, not enemy psychology. But Patton believed that war was personal, that the man whose ideas shaped the forces on the other side mattered as much as the divisions themselves. And so he turned warfare into a kind of intimate competition. A duel between minds played out across deserts and fields with thousands of lives as the stakes. It was brilliant, it was effective, and it was deeply, strangely personal in a way that most military operations aren't. He visited wounded soldiers constantly. Patton's public image was cold, harsh, demanding. But he visited field hospitals more than almost any other general. He walked through wards filled with men who'd been shattered by his orders, and he talked to them, not speeches, conversations. He asked about their wounds, their hometowns, what they needed, and he listened. The soldiers didn't always know how to respond. This was the same man who'd just pushed them through hell, who demanded they keep advancing even when it seemed impossible. And now he was standing next to their bed, asking if they needed anything. Some of them were angry, some were grateful, most were just confused. But Patton kept doing it, because underneath the bluster, underneath the persona he'd constructed, he carried the weight of command in a way that never left him. He knew that every mile his army gained cost blood, and he needed to see the cost, to look at it, to make sure he never forgot what his decisions actually meant. The hospital visits weren't public relations, they were private penance, a way of reminding himself that the men he spent so casually in his operational orders were real, and that their suffering was his responsibility. The slapping incidents make more sense in this context. Patton visited so many wounded men, men with missing limbs and shattered bones, men who'd taken bullets and shrapnel and kept fighting. And then he encountered men who looked fine but couldn't continue, and something in him snapped, because he'd just seen what real wounds looked like, and to him, invisible wounds weren't real. They were weakness. It was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong, but it came from the same place as the hospital visits, from a man who was drowning in the human cost of his own success and didn't know how to process it. He named his headquarters after himself. When Patton established his command post in Europe, he named it Lucky Forward, not Third Army Headquarters, not something official or neutral. Lucky Forward, because Patton believed in luck, his own luck specifically. He saw himself as a man touched by fortune, guided by fate, protected by forces that ensured he'd be in the right place at the right moment. His staff rolled their eyes, but they also noticed that Lucky Forward did seem to avoid the worst of the German counterattacks. That supply lines held when they shouldn't have. That intelligence arrived just in time. Was it luck? Was it Patton's obsessive planning creating the conditions for what looked like luck? Was it confirmation bias, where everyone remembered the narrow escapes and forgot the failures? Probably all of those things. But Patton never questioned it. To him, calling the headquarters Lucky Forward wasn't arrogance. It was acknowledgement, a way of honoring the force he believed was protecting him, and maybe, on some level, a way of invoking it. If you name something lucky, maybe luck pays attention. It's magical thinking, superstition. But Patton lived in a world where prayer changed the weather and omens predicted victory. So why wouldn't naming your headquarters correctly matter? In his cosmology, everything mattered. And Lucky Forward was just one more way of aligning himself with the destiny he believed was already written. He hated logistics but understood it perfectly. Patton projected an image of a general who cared only about speed and aggression, who wanted to charge forward and let someone else worry about fuel and ammunition. But the truth was more complicated. He understood logistics better than almost anyone. He had to, because the kind of fast, deep armored thrusts he favored only worked if the supply lines could keep up. He'd spend hours with his logistics officers, demanding to know exactly how much fuel he had, how far it would take him, what the resupply schedule looked like. He'd argue for priority on supply convoys. He'd push his quartermaster staff as hard as he pushed his combat commanders. And when supplies ran short, which they often did because Patton's advances outpaced the ability to sustain them, he'd rage about it. But here's the thing, he knew. He knew he was asking for the impossible. He knew that moving an entire army hundreds of miles in days required a logistical miracle. And he demanded it anyway, because he believed that if you set impossible standards, people would achieve nearly impossible things, and they did. His supply officers performed miracles. They scrounged, improvised, rerouted, and somehow kept the Third Army moving when every calculation said they should have stalled. Patton's genius wasn't ignoring logistics. It was understanding logistics well enough to know exactly how far he could push before the whole operation collapsed. He lived on that edge, constantly, and while it drove his staff insane, it also meant that he extracted more movement, more momentum, more operational reach out of his forces than should have been possible. He didn't ignore the rules of logistics. He just refused to accept them as limits. He believed in collective punishment. When Patton's army liberated concentration camps, he was horrified. Not just at the camps themselves, but at the German civilians living nearby who claimed they didn't know. Patton didn't believe them, and he didn't forgive them. He ordered entire towns to tour the camps, to see the evidence, to walk through what had been done in their name. He made them bury the dead. German civilians, many of them elderly, digging graves for the victims of camps they claimed to know nothing about. It was harsh. Some argued it was cruel. Patton didn't care. To him, ignorance wasn't innocence. And if you lived next to a death camp and chose not to know, you were complicit. This wasn't policy. This was Patton deciding, on his own authority, how to respond to something that had shaken him to his core. And while other commanders might have handled it through official channels, through reports and tribunals, Patton handled it the way he handled everything, directly, immediately, and with a certainty that he was right. It created controversy, but it also created a record. Photographs of German civilians confronting the reality of the Holocaust, forced to witness what they'd allowed to happen. And decades later, those images became part of the historical record, evidence that the truth had been forced into the open, that someone had made sure the people responsible, even passively responsible, had to look at what they'd enabled. Patton believed in accountability, collective, harsh, immediate accountability. And while his methods were blunt, they came from a genuine moral fury. A rage at the idea that people could participate in or ignore atrocity and then claim innocence. He wouldn't allow it. And he used his authority to make sure the truth was unavoidable. He couldn't transition to peacetime. When the war in Europe ended, Patton was lost, literally lost. He didn't know what to do with himself. He was assigned to occupation duties in Bavaria, administrative work, reconstruction, and he was terrible at it. Not because he lacked the intelligence, but because he lacked the temperament. He'd spent his entire adult life preparing for war, fighting war, thinking about the next war. And now there was no war. And he didn't know how to exist in that world. He made increasingly erratic statements. He suggested the Allies should immediately rearm the Germans and attack the Soviet Union. He compared Nazi party members to Democrats and Republicans, just people with different political views, which created an enormous scandal. He was reckless with the press, dismissive of denazification efforts, openly contemptuous of the occupation mission. Eisenhower, who'd protected Patton through multiple controversies, finally had to relieve him of command. It was done quietly, with as much dignity as possible. Patton was reassigned to a ceremonial position, essentially retired in place, and he fell apart. He drank more. He became depressed. He talked openly about feeling useless, obsolete, unnecessary. The war had given Patton purpose. It had proven, at least in his mind, that everything he believed about himself was true. that he was a warrior reborn across centuries, destined for glory, aligned with divine will. And when the war ended, all of that collapsed. He was just a man, aging, out of place, no longer needed, and he couldn't accept it. The fact that he died just months after the war ended, before he had to fully reckon with a life without combat, might have been a mercy. Because George Patton without a war wasn't George Patton at all. It was just a man in a costume waiting for a stage that no longer existed. He wrote letters to his wife that contradicted everything he said publicly. Patton's letters to his wife, Beatrice, reveal a completely different man than the one his soldiers saw. In public, he was certainty incarnate. In private, he was full of doubt. He wrote to her about his fears, not of dying, but of failing, of being inadequate, of not living up to the destiny he believed was his. He admitted loneliness, frustration, exhaustion. He told her things he'd never say to his staff, that he was afraid other generals were being given opportunities that should have been his, that he worried he was too old, too slow, that younger men were surpassing him, that he felt unappreciated, misunderstood, used. Beatrice kept every letter, and reading them now, you see the gap between the persona and the person. Patton constructed an image of absolute confidence because he believed command required it. But the cost of maintaining that image was isolation. He couldn't show weakness to his men. He couldn't show doubt to his peers. So he showed it to Beatrice. In letters written late at night, after the day's battles were planned, and the staff had left, and he was alone. Those letters are some of the most human things Patton ever wrote. Because in them, he wasn't trying to be a legend. He was just trying to be understood. And the fact that he could only be that honest with one person, in private correspondence, says everything about the burden of the image he'd created. He'd built a character so powerful that he'd trapped himself inside it. And the only escape was in letters to the woman who'd known him before he became George S. Patton. He believed material wealth was spiritually dangerous. Patton came from money, old money. His family was wealthy, connected, privileged, and he despised it. Not the comfort, not the opportunities it gave him, but the softness he believed it encouraged. He thought wealth made men weak, that comfort eroded the warrior spirit, and he was terrified of it happening to him. So he imposed hardships on himself. He'd sleep on the ground when he didn't have to. He'd refuse creature comforts his rank entitled him to. He'd push himself physically, long past the point of necessity, because he believed that if he ever got soft, if he ever let ease seduce him, he'd lose whatever edge made him effective. This created a strange contradiction. He lived in a world of privilege, attended elite schools, had access to resources most people couldn't imagine. But he resented all of it. He saw it as an obstacle, something to overcome rather than enjoy. And that resentment shaped how he led. He demanded hardship from his men because he demanded it from himself. He believed suffering built character, that ease destroyed it. Looking back, it's easy to see this as the worldview of someone who could afford to romanticize hardship because he'd never experienced real poverty, and there's truth to that. But Patton genuinely believed it. He saw wealth as a spiritual test, one that most people failed. And he was determined not to fail it, even if it meant denying himself comforts he'd earned, even if it meant alienating people who didn't understand why a general would refuse a proper bed or a heated tent. Because to Patton, comfort wasn't just unnecessary, it was corrupting, and he'd rather be cold and sharp than warm and weak. He knew exactly when he was being used. Patton wasn't naive about his position in the Allied command structure. He knew Eisenhower used him. He knew that when they needed someone to draw German attention, to make noise, to threaten, they sent Patton. And when they needed careful diplomatic operations, they sent someone else. He knew he was the hammer, not the scalpel. And it infuriated him, but he also understood the game well enough to play it. He'd make noise when it benefited him. He'd court controversy when he needed to stay relevant. He'd take risks that other generals wouldn't, because he knew that as long as he kept winning, they couldn't afford to sideline him completely. There's a calculation in that, a cold awareness that his value was tied to his effectiveness, and that the moment he stopped being useful, or the moment the war ended, he'd be discarded. He was right. When the fighting stopped, Patton's usefulness evaporated, and Eisenhower, who'd protected him through scandal after scandal, had no problem removing him from command when he became a political liability. Patton saw it coming. He wrote about it in his diary. He knew that the army didn't love him. They used him, and the tragedy is that he needed them as much as they needed him. Because without the army, without war, Patton had no identity. He was a weapon, and weapons don't retire gracefully. They're either used until they break, or they're put away and forgotten. Patton understood that, and he hated it. But he didn't know how to be anything else. So what do you do with a man like this? A man who believed he'd lived a dozen lives and would die gloriously in battle, who designed swords and prayed for weather and slapped soldiers and wrote poetry in the dark. A man who understood logistics but hated it, who studied his enemies like a psychologist, who carried the weight of every wounded soldier he visited and still demanded more from the ones who could still fight. You don't simplify him. That's the mistake. Patton has been turned into a symbol so many times by so many people with so many different agendas that the actual human being gets lost. The warrior poet, the brutal taskmaster, the reincarnated Roman, the tragic hero, the war criminal, the genius, the madman. He was all of those things, and none of them completely. What these details reveal, these strange overlooked pieces of who he actually was, is that George Patton lived in a state of permanent contradiction. He was certain and he was doubtful. He was cruel and he was tender. He was a showman who despised pretense and a mystic who demanded results. He believed in destiny but worked harder than almost anyone because he wasn't willing to leave anything to fate. And maybe that's the real truth about Patton. He wasn't one thing. He was a man desperately trying to become the legend he believed he was supposed to be. And the effort of maintaining that, of living up to a cosmic destiny he invented for himself, shaped every strange decision, every ritual, every contradiction. The revolvers were part of the costume, but the prayer was real. The slapping came from the same place as the hospital visits. The poetry revealed what the profanity concealed. He fired boring officers because he needed men who burned as intensely as he did, because anything less felt like betrayal of the mission. He studied Rommel's psychology because to him, war wasn't just strategic, it was personal, intimate, a contest between wills as much as armies. And when you look at all of it together, what you see is a man who believed so completely in his own mythic purpose that he turned himself into a weapon. He sharpened every edge, eliminated every weakness, demanded from himself what no human being should have to sustain, and it worked. For a while. During the war, when that weapon was needed, when there was an enemy to point him at, and a mission that required exactly his kind of relentless, brilliant, costly aggression. But weapons don't retire, and men who turn themselves into weapons don't know how to stop being what they've made themselves into. Patton spent his whole life preparing for a war he believed he'd been fighting across multiple lifetimes. And when that war ended, when he survived it, he discovered that survival wasn't the reward he'd imagined. It was just the moment when everything he'd built his identity around disappeared. The car accident that killed him, that ordinary, unheroic death in a hospital bed, might be the most telling detail of all. Because George Patton, who believed in omens and divine purpose and cosmic destiny, who was certain he'd die gloriously in battle, didn't get the ending he wanted. He got the ending he feared. An ending that proved he was just a man after all. But the details we've looked at tonight, these 20 strange pieces of who he actually was, they matter because they show us something more nuanced than the legend. They show us a human being wrestling with fear and faith and contradiction. A man who built himself into something larger than life because he believed that's what history required of him. And maybe he was right. Maybe the Allies needed exactly that kind of commander at exactly that moment. Someone willing to pay the human cost for speed. Someone who'd push past every reasonable limit because he didn't believe limits applied to him. History gave us George Patton. Flawed, brilliant, cruel, poetic, mystical, calculated, and completely, utterly certain that he was meant for this. And for 2 years in Europe, that certainty moved faster and hit harder than almost anything the German army had ever encountered. The strangeness wasn't incidental to his effectiveness, it was the source of it, and that's the uncomfortable truth that these details reveal. The things that made Patton great were the same things that made him difficult, controversial, sometimes monstrous. You couldn't have one without the other. The man who prayed for weather with absolute conviction was the same man who slapped soldiers suffering from trauma. The general who wrote poetry about the loneliness of command was the same general who fired competent officers for lacking charisma. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't villain. He was something stranger and more real than either of those categories allows. He was George S. Patton, a man who believed he'd been a warrior across multiple lifetimes, who carried ivory-handled revolvers as props in a performance he believed was cosmically significant, who studied his enemies with psychological precision and visited his wounded with something close to penance. And in the end, maybe the weirdest fact of all is this: it worked. The performance, the mysticism, the contradictions, the relentless self-mythology, all of it combined to create a general who changed the course of the war in Europe. Not in spite of the strangeness, because of it. That's who George Patton was, not the legend, not the caricature, but the complicated, brilliant, troubled man underneath. And these details, overlooked and strange as they are, bring us closer to understanding him than any statue or movie ever could. Because the truth is always stranger than the legend. And in Patton's case, it's also more human.